U.S. Fidel Castro, Cuba's former president and leader of the Communist Revolution, has died at the age of 90. Remembered as the firebrand leader in rumpled fatigues, Castro survived countless assassination attempts and often joked about death. In the end, it was illness and old age that claimed him. His death was announced by his younger brother Raul on state television.
Querido pueblo de Cuba, con profundo dolor.
Dear people of Cuba, with deep sadness, I inform our people, the friends of our America and the world, that today, November 25th, 2016, at 10:29 in the night, the Commander-in-Chief of the Cuban Revolution, Fidel Castro Ruz, has died. According to the will of Comrade Fidel, his remains will be cremated.
Well, President Raul Castro said that the details of the funeral will be announced in a few hours. Fidel Castro was a divisive figure, even long after passing the reins of power to his brother. For the last 10 years, he'd largely been absent from public life. The energetic leader gave way to a frail, elderly man. So how are ordinary Cubans responding to his death? We have these reactions from Havana.
Death is a normal part of life, but even so, it's something you're never prepared for, especially when the Commander-in-Chief dies. It's very painful for all of us. It's really affected me. I am quite sad. He was a figure everybody knew and respected. I feel quite bad.
Well, meanwhile, Cubans living in the U.S. state of Florida have been rejoicing at the news of Fidel Castro's death. Hundreds of people exiled from the communist state took to the streets of Miami, waving Cuban flags, cheering and honking car horns to celebrate the death of the revolutionary leader. Many Cubans living abroad saw Castro as a ruthless tyrant who was responsible for crippling the Cuban economy. Well, Fidel Castro rose to become an iconic figure of the 20th century. After leading a rebel army to victory in Cuba, he embraced Soviet-style communism. He was a thorn in the side of 10 U.S. presidents during his half-century rule. His supporters say he gave Cuba back to its people. But for critics, he was a dictator who deprived Cubans of their basic rights. We have this look back at Castro's revolutionary life.
With his beard, cigar and olive green combat fatigues, Fidel Castro was an icon of the 20th century. Castro symbolised both the independence struggle in the Third World as well as the failure of socialism. In 1959, after years of struggle, Castro's rebels were able to drive dictator Batista out of Cuba. In Havana, there were scenes of celebration. The poor especially had high hopes. For the first time, there was education and access to medical care for all. Major landowners and industrialists lost their businesses, including many Americans. The US responded furiously and put Cuba under a trade embargo. Cuba turned toward the Soviet Union. In 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. The Soviets deployed nuclear missiles on the US's doorstep. United States President John F. Kennedy ordered a naval blockade of Cuba. After tense negotiations, the Soviets withdrew the missiles. Standing up to the US won Fidel Castro's support in the developing world. But at home, his dictatorship became ever more severe. The support of the Soviet Union helped Cubans enjoy moderate prosperity for a time. But the collapse of the USSR in 1991 devastated Cuba's economy. Increasing numbers of Cubans tried to escape by sea. The Marxist leader was forced to change course. Private markets were legalised, as was the use of the US dollar. By the end of the 1990s, the worst was over, thanks to aid from oil-rich neighbour Venezuela. Fidel Castro was increasingly frail. In July 2006, he fell seriously ill. He handed over official business to his brother Raul, at first only temporarily, and then in 2008 permanently. In September 2010, Castro gave his final public speech. For the last time, thousands of spectators turn out in front of the Museum of the Revolution in Havana. Castro's public appearances became increasingly rare. He occasionally met privately with world leaders, like Pope Benedict in 2012. He last appeared in public at a gala for his 90th birthday 3 months ago. To the end, Fidel Castro was a divisive figure. To some, a brutal dictator. To others, the embodiment of revolution.
Let's now bring in journalist Bettina Poileka, who is in Havana. Bettina, I think it's safe to say that for better or for worse, Fidel Castro has had a profound impact on Cuba. How are people in Havana taking the news of his death?
Honestly, well, first of all, of course, he had this profound influence, but people are just basically really waking up to the news because it happened in the middle of the night, and I myself was not really aware of it. I was taking somebody to the airport, and then I came back, and nobody had known. It was not announced yet, so not that many people are aware of what has happened already, and it will have to be seen during the day how the reactions on the streets in the morning will be.
Well, Castro has been out of the limelight for quite a long time, nearly 10 years. He was very ill. He withdrew from the public sphere. And nevertheless, what kind of an impact is his death likely to have on Cuba as a country?
That also, of course, has to be seen. I mean, he will be remembered for his courage and for his dreams and for his perseverance. I mean, he achieved many things, so he is an icon. He is a symbol, as it has been said before, and people will mourn him for that. If for nothing else, he will be remembered with respect, and the future will now be in the hands of his brother. I was here coincidentally 2 years ago when the diplomatic relations with the U.S. were announced again. And then we had a reaction that I think could be an analogy to what is going to happen now, because the faithful hardliners, the so-called Fidelistas, were skeptical about what was going to happen with the new opening, the new change. The Raulistas, those who are and were and are with his brothers, are the more realistic people. So probably now that Fidel is gone and he is past of the past, so to speak, the economic necessities that call for new moves might be easier to achieve with his brother without the other parts still there.
All right, Bettina Poileka talking to us from Havana. Many thanks indeed.